I didn't think cutting a few tree roots would turn into a landslide that nearly took out my neighbor's house. But that's exactly what happened, and the worst part is, he's the one who forced it. It all started with a knock on my door one afternoon, the kind that already sounds angry before you even open it, and standing there was my downhill neighbor, arms crossed, jaw tight, like he'd been rehearsing this confrontation all morning. Now, I live on a hillside in a quiet part of Northern California, the kind of neighborhood where people wave when they drive by but don't really know each other beyond that. And my place sits a little higher up the slope, not dramatically, but enough that gravity is always working in my favor and, apparently, sometimes against other people. My neighbor, his name's Randall, bought the house below mine about 2 years ago, came in with big plans, modern renovations, clean lines, concrete everything. The type who looks at nature and sees something that needs to be managed instead of respected. Right on the edge of my property, near the slope that drops into his yard, there's this massive old oak tree, easily 60 years old, maybe older, the kind of tree that doesn't just sit there, it anchors everything around it. Its roots spread wide and deep, holding the hillside together in ways you don't really think about until someone tries to mess with them. I'd always liked that tree, not in some sentimental, hugging it every morning kind of way, but it gave the yard character, shade in the summer, and honestly, it made the whole place feel stable, like it had been there long before me and would be there long after. Randall didn't see it that way. He didn't even say hello when I opened the door, just got straight into it, voice already raised. Your tree is crossing onto my property, and it's a problem. I remember blinking at him for a second, trying to catch up, because in my mind we were still at the stage where neighbors introduce themselves properly, maybe borrow tools, not this. What do you mean? I asked, stepping outside so we could actually look at whatever he was talking about. He turned and pointed downhill toward the slope between our properties, where an old retaining wall ran along his side, built from stacked natural stone, probably decades ago, slightly uneven but holding strong, at least it had been. I'm putting in a new patio, he said, like that explained everything. And when my guys started digging, they hit these thick roots coming from your tree. They're crossing the property line. That's encroachment. There was something about the way he said encroachment, like he'd been waiting to use that word, like it gave him leverage. So we walked down together, and sure enough, where his contractors had started excavating, you could see them, thick, twisting roots pushing into the soil on his side. Not just little feeder roots either. These were structural, the kind that don't just belong to a tree, they belong to the land itself. I crouched down, brushing some dirt away, and I could already see the issue forming in my head before he even said it out loud. These roots, he continued, need to be removed. Completely. I want a clean line for the patio foundation. I straightened up and looked at him, really looked this time, trying to figure out if he understood what he was asking. Randall, these aren't just random roots. They're holding the soil together along this slope. That wall of yours. It's relying on this system more than you probably realize. He let out this short, dismissive laugh, like I was overcomplicating something simple. It's just a tree, he said, and it's on your property. If it's crossing into mine, you're responsible. That was the first moment I felt that shift, that subtle tightening in my chest where you realize this isn't going to be a normal conversation. I'm not saying we ignore it, I replied, trying to keep things calm, but we need to be careful. Cutting those roots could destabilize the slope, especially with the kind of soil we have here. It's sandy. It doesn't hold well on its own. He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with that controlled irritation that somehow feels worse. I don't care about the slope, he said, flat and cold. I care about my property, my investment. Those roots are in the way, and they're lowering my property value. I want them gone. There it was, clear as day. This wasn't about safety or even practicality. It was about control, about having things exactly the way he wanted them, even if it meant ignoring everything else. I suggested bringing in an arborist, someone qualified who could assess the situation properly, maybe come up with a solution that didn't involve cutting the literal support system out from under his yard. I even offered to split the cost, which in hindsight feels almost ridiculous now, considering how things turned out. But he shut that down immediately, shaking his head before I even finished the sentence. No, I don't need an opinion. I need action. A couple days passed, and I figured maybe he'd cool off, maybe rethink things once his contractors explained the risks. But instead, I got a certified letter in the mail, formal, legal language, demanding that I remove all encroaching roots along the property line within a specified time frame or face legal action. I remember standing there in my kitchen, letter in hand, reading it twice, then a third time, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't quite believe how far he was willing to push this. And that's when something shifted in me too, not anger exactly, more like a quiet decision settling into place. If he wanted those roots gone, fine. I'd make sure they were gone, exactly as requested. So I sat with that letter for a while, turning it over in my hands like somehow the tone might change if I looked at it from a different angle. But it didn't. It was clear, formal, and just aggressive enough to make it obvious he'd already spoken to a lawyer. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was heading straight into that territory where every word, every action starts to matter in a very specific, documented way. And if that's the game he wanted to play, then I was going to play it properly. I didn't go knock on his door, didn't try to argue again, because honestly, I'd already seen how that would go. Instead, I picked up the phone and called a certified arborist, a guy named Marcus, someone local who'd been working these hills for decades, the kind of person who doesn't just look at trees, he reads the land around them, understands how everything connects beneath the surface in ways most people never think about. When I explained the situation, there was a pause on the line, not long, just enough for me to picture him nodding slowly to himself. Yeah, he said finally. I've seen this before. Not good. We set a time for him to come out, and when he did, he didn't even say much at first, just walked the slope, crouched near the exposed roots, tapped at the soil with his boot, then stood back and looked at the retaining wall on Randall's side, really studied it like he was putting together a puzzle that already had a missing piece. After a few minutes, he let out a quiet breath and turned to me. Those roots, he said, pointing down the line where they crossed into Randall's yard. They're doing a lot more than just feeding that tree. They're anchoring this whole section. You cut them clean, especially multiple anchors. You're asking for movement. I nodded, because that confirmed exactly what I'd been trying to explain earlier, but hearing it from someone like Marcus carried a different kind of weight. The neighbor sent a legal demand, I told him, handing over the letter. He wants everything on his side removed. Marcus read it carefully, lips pressed into a thin line, then handed it back. Well, he said, a little reluctantly, legally speaking, he does have the right to cut anything that crosses onto his property. And if he's demanding you do it, and you comply, that's documented. He looked back at the slope again, then at me. But I'm telling you straight, this is a bad idea. I remember leaning against the porch railing, staring down at that tree, at the way its roots disappeared into the ground like veins, holding everything together, and I felt that hesitation again, that moment where you could still step back, still try to find some middle ground. But then I thought about the letter, about the way Randall had stood there talking about property value like nothing else mattered, and something in me just settled. Okay, I said quietly. Then we do it. But we do it by the book. And that became the plan, not reckless, not sloppy, but precise, documented, undeniable. We scheduled the work for the following week, and when Marcus and his crew showed up, they came prepared, trenching tools, root saws, barriers, everything you'd expect for a clean, controlled job, not some rushed hack job. Because if this was going to happen, it was going to be done in a way that no one could question later. Before they even started, Marcus took photos, wide shots of the slope, close-ups of the roots, the retaining wall, everything, time-stamped, detailed, like he already knew this might end up being looked at by more than just us. Randall came out at one point, stood at the edge of his yard watching, arms folded again. But this time there was a hint of satisfaction in his expression, like he was finally getting what he wanted. You're cutting all of them, right? He called up. I walked down just enough so he could hear me clearly. Everything that crosses the line, I said. Exactly what you asked for. He gave a short nod, almost smug. Good. That's all I wanted. There was something about that moment, the simplicity of it, the confidence, that stuck with me, because it felt like he thought this was the end of the story, like once those roots were gone, everything would just be better. The crew got to work, and it wasn't quick. These weren't small roots you could just clip and move on. They had to dig carefully along the property line, exposing each major root before cutting it. And when they hit the first big one, you could see it immediately, thick, solid, like a natural beam running through the soil. Marcus crouched beside it, ran his hand along the surface, then looked up at me. "This one's doing serious work," he said quietly. I nodded. "Cut it." The saw kicked in, loud, biting into the wood. And there was this strange moment, almost like tension releasing through the ground itself, subtle, but noticeable if you were paying attention. And I remember thinking, that's one. By the time they were done, 3 major anchor roots had been severed, clean cuts right along the boundary, just like the letter demanded. And after that, they installed a root barrier, a solid physical divider to prevent regrowth into Randall's side, essentially sealing the deal, making sure nothing from that tree would ever cross that line again. When it was finished, Marcus took more photos, documented everything, then handed me a written report detailing the work, the condition of the slope, and most importantly, his professional warning about potential instability due to root removal. "Keep this," he said. "You might need it." I thanked him, paid the invoice, and just like that, it was done. Or at least, that's what it felt like at the time. For about a week, nothing really changed. The slope looked the same. The wall stood where it always had. Randall's contractors resumed work on the patio, pouring sections of concrete, framing out the space. Everything moving forward like his plan was finally back on track. I'd see him occasionally, out in his yard, checking progress, talking to the crew, and once or twice he glanced up toward my place. But there was no more confrontation, no more tension, just this quiet, unspoken sense that the issue had been resolved. And I'll admit, a small part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, things would hold. That maybe the impact wouldn't be as immediate or as severe as Marcus had suggested, because sometimes the ground doesn't shift right away, sometimes it takes a trigger. And then the rain came. Not just a light drizzle, not the kind that freshens the air and passes by, but steady, heavy autumn rain, the kind that soaks deep into the soil, hour after hour, day after day, until everything underneath starts to change. It rained for 3 straight days, no break, just this constant, quiet pressure building beneath the surface, water seeping into every gap, every space where those roots used to be, turning compact soil into something heavier, looser, more willing to move. I remember standing at my kitchen window that third morning, coffee in hand, watching the hillside, and there was something different about it. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to immediately. But if you've lived around slopes long enough, you start to notice the subtle signs, the way the ground looks just a little too saturated, the way small rivulets start forming where they didn't before. And that's when Marcus's voice echoed back in my head, calm, certain, "You're asking for movement." By the 3rd day of rain, everything felt heavier, the air, the ground, even the silence between sounds, like the whole hillside was holding its breath. And I remember thinking, not in a dramatic way, just quietly to myself, this is probably when something gives. I was out on my back porch that morning, coffee in hand, leaning against the railing, watching the slope the way you do when you don't fully trust it anymore. And for a while, nothing happened, just rain tapping against the wood, water sliding down the hill in thin, restless lines, and then I heard it. It wasn't loud at first, more like a sharp crack, like a branch snapping somewhere deep where you couldn't see it, quick, sudden, out of place, and right after that, this low, rolling sound, not quite a rumble, not quite a slide, but something in between, something that didn't belong on a quiet morning. I set the mug down without even realizing it and stepped closer to the edge, eyes scanning the slope, and that's when I saw it. Randall's retaining wall, the old stone one that had been standing there for who knows how long. It wasn't straight anymore. It was bowing, just slightly at first, like it was taking a breath outward, the center pushing away from the hillside while the ends stayed anchored. And there was this split second where everything slowed down, where your brain is trying to catch up to what your eyes are telling you, because part of you still wants to believe it's nothing, just your imagination, but it wasn't. The stones shifted again, a little more this time, and then came another crack, louder, sharper, and that was it. That was the moment where the whole thing let go. The wall didn't just collapse, it failed, like something giving way under too much pressure all at once, stones breaking apart, sliding forward as the saturated earth behind them surged outward, and suddenly the entire slope was moving, not fast like an explosion, but heavy, unstoppable, a mass of mud, rock, and those severed roots we had cut just weeks earlier. all of it sliding down into Randall's yard like gravity had finally decided it had waited long enough. I stood there frozen, watching it unfold, the sound growing deeper, louder, like a slow avalanche, and below, I could see the edge of his new patio, that clean, modern concrete he'd been so focused on, and for a brief second it just sat there, untouched, and then the slide hit it. The mud slammed into the structure, pushing against it, cracking sections, lifting others, and then the whole thing started to disappear under the weight. Concrete vanishing beneath layers of wet soil, rebar twisting as the ground shifted beneath it, and it didn't stop there. The movement carried forward, straight into the back of his house. There was this sharp, shattering sound as the sliding glass doors gave way, glass breaking outward as debris pressed against it. And then everything settled, not neatly, not cleanly, just stopped, leaving behind this chaotic, uneven mass where a backyard used to be. For a moment, there was silence again, except for the rain, still falling, still steady, like none of it had just happened. And then Randall came running out. He burst through what was left of his back door in a bathrobe, slipping slightly on the wet ground as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, his eyes wide, darting across the damage, and then they landed on me, up on the porch. "Your tree," he shouted, voice cracking somewhere between anger and disbelief. "Your tree caused this." I didn't say anything right away, not because I didn't have something to say, but because there was nothing that would have changed what was already in front of us. The slope, the wall, the patio. It had all become one continuous mess, and we both knew exactly how we got there. Over the next couple of days, things got busy in that official, procedural way they always do after something goes wrong. Insurance adjusters, inspectors, contractors walking the site, taking notes, measuring damage, trying to piece together not just what happened, but why. When the adjuster came to speak with me, I didn't try to explain everything from memory. I just went inside, grabbed the folder I'd put together, and handed it over. The certified letter from Randall demanding the root removal, the photos from before and after the work, Marcus's report clearly stating the risk of instability if those structural roots were cut. He stood there flipping through the pages, taking his time, occasionally glancing out toward the slope, then back at the documents, connecting the dots in that quiet, methodical way professionals do when they're building a conclusion they know they'll have to stand behind. Eventually, he closed the folder and walked down to where Randall was standing, still visibly shaken, still trying to argue his version of events to anyone who would listen. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. "Sir," the adjuster said, calm, firm, "you requested the removal of vegetation that was stabilizing the soil on this slope. That action directly contributed to the failure we're seeing here." Randall shook his head immediately, hands raised in frustration. It was his tree. It came from his property. The adjuster didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, just held up the letter slightly. "And this is your request for its removal. Given the documentation and the professional assessment provided prior to the work, this is considered a self-inflicted loss." There was a pause after that, a heavy one, like the weight of those words needed a second to settle in, and you could see it on Randall's face, that moment where realization starts to replace anger, where the argument you thought you had suddenly doesn't hold up anymore. "So what does that mean?" he asked, quieter now. "It means your policy will not cover the damages related to this event." No drama, no drawn-out explanation, just a simple statement, but it landed harder than anything else that day. In the weeks that followed, the cleanup began, crews hauling away mud and broken stone, tearing out what was left of the patio, assessing the structural damage to the house, and eventually, plans were drawn up for a new retaining wall, not the old stacked stone this time, but a fully engineered system, reinforced, anchored deep, designed to handle exactly the kind of forces that had just torn through the slope. I heard the number through the usual neighborhood channels, conversations that drift from one yard to another, somewhere around $50,000, maybe more by the time it was all done, all of it out of pocket. As for the oak tree, it stayed. It looked a little rough for a while. Losing those major roots wasn't nothing, but oaks are resilient. They adapt, they find new balance, and over time, it settled back into itself. Leaves full, branches steady, still standing at the edge of the slope like it always had, just with a clearer boundary now. Randall and I don't talk much these days, not out of open hostility, Just that quiet distance that forms after something like this, where everything that needed to be said already has been, whether out loud or not. And every now and then, when I'm out on that porch with my coffee, looking down at the new wall, the rebuilt yard, I think about how easily it could have gone differently, how a single decision, pushed by pride or impatience or just not wanting to hear no, can set off a chain of events that no one can stop once it starts. Because the truth is, the tree didn't cause that landslide. It was the absence of what was holding everything together that did. So I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have refused, risked the legal fight, or done exactly what I did and let the consequences play out? And if you were in Randall's shoes, would you still say it was worth it for that clean line? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd expect. And if you've ever seen something like this happen in your own neighborhood, I'd really like to hear that too.